Welcome to day 6 of the Novel Challenge. My name is Brad Paquette, and today we're going to talk about the greatest story ever told. So, one of the limitations of the Novel Challenge videos is that I want to keep the time frame short. As I've told you before, I want to empower you to put as much time on target as possible. And that means, writing your book, not listening to endless videos from me. So we've given you this simplified version of the novel matrix system, and but there's a lot more to be said on these topics. So as always, I encourage you to check out the novel matrix book, check out the classes that are available at writers.company. Those are going to be super helpful in taking it to the next level. Because one of the things that we're missing in these classes is I don't have the opportunity to give you lots of different examples of how these systems and structures are employed. And typically, when I teach this class to my apprentices here in Cambridge, Ohio, or I teach it in an online setting, or I'm invited to a conference or whatever, there's this aha moment that happens when we talk about lots of different stories across many different genres, and we see how these components are used. There's this aha moment where the things that I've been describing to you change from this box that you have to fill on your plan into a tool that is there for you to leverage. And that's really, really important. Like there's this moment where somebody says, "Oh, I get it now. I see how Tom Hagen from The Godfather and R2D2 from Star Wars and even Albert Brenneman from the romantic comedy Hitch, I see how those are the same character. I see how, well, really, they're very different characters, but I see how that function is portrayed, how they're all doing the thing that they need to do in order to compel the story forward in the same way. And I see how different storytellers have taken that function and they've used that tool in a creative way. And that actually inspires me. I see how I can use those tools in a creative way. You know, on the topic of characters, same thing with like an antagonist and mega antagonist. People are like, I take your word for it. I see Darth Vader and the Emperor, but then we keep going with other examples and they see, oh, I see how the bank inspector and Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life are doing the same thing. There's a little system and a big system. I see how Cato and President Snow in the Hunger Games are doing the same thing. And again, there's that light bulb moment where instead of this being some rigid prescription that you have to follow, you see that, oh, these are actually tools in my bag. This is how I get to talk about the things that I really want to talk about. This is how I draw out of the story all the good stuff that's actually important, more than just being, a fun series of events on the page. So I would just love for you to have that moment as well, because it's gonna, what I've given you in the novel matrix, it's enough. You'll get the job done with this, and it's gonna help your structure a lot, and it's gonna make the book way more accomplishable than if you didn't have it. But I want you to have that moment where this stuff turns into assets for you, turns into assets, and you see how you can still be creative and you can be inspired and you can do new things that nobody's ever done with it before, but still utilize those same functions and structures. And it's all the examples that are really gonna open that up for you. Are gonna blow that thing wide open. So we don't have time in this format to do all that, but there is one example that I have to give you. Really, no discussion of story would be complete without touching upon this book. It's that powerful. So let me give you some statistics about this book that I want to talk about. It has sold more than 5 billion copies on the planet Earth. This book has been translated into more than 3,500 languages. There are fan clubs actually that meet every single week on every continent of the globe to talk about this book, including Antarctica. And of course, the book that I'm talking about is the Bible. Now, hear me out. Even if you're not religious, based on those statistics I just gave you, there's something going on with the Bible that's worth exploring. There is something about this book that works. So, and I get it. You might be saying, well, that's just a product of coercion or some kind of traditionalism or something like that. It's not actually based on the merits of the book. But data proves you wrong in that, actually. There are countless stories of people that have encountered the book and they have interacted with the book, and it has inspired them to become disciples of the book, to start their own fan club. to change their lives in dramatic ways without any of the tradition, without any of the culture or, what appears to be to you to be coercion or anything like that. People encounter the book and it has an impact on their life. So the book is doing something. And frankly, if as writers, if we could do 1% of what the book does, if we could achieve 1% of what the Bible has achieved, you would be one of the most successful authors to have ever graced the planet Earth. So there is something, religious or not, there is something to be learned here. So the Bible is a love story. If we were going to put it in a genre, it's romance. It's a story about God and his love for man and how that was lost and then how it has been recovered. So, of course, the Bible didn't come into being like most books do. The Bible is actually written by 35 different people. And most of them didn't have any contact with any of the other authors, and they had limited knowledge of anything that the other authors did or would say in the future. These authors, many of them were separated by thousands of years and different countries, different cultures. So we have 35 different authors that come together. There are 66 books in the Bible written by those 35 authors, and they tell one comprehensive, compelling story, which, if you think about it, that in itself is miraculous. Just this year, Allie, Prince, and I, we made the book Lawless, which is an anthology of short stories inspired by the book of Judges. And we included 18 authors in that. And prior to the authors writing their story, we gave them a bunch of information about the sci-fi dystopian world that they all needed to set their stories in. And the storylines didn't need to connect. The characters could be all different. They just had to get the same setting right between these 18 different authors. And they could ask as many questions to us, the central editors, as they needed. Let me tell you, when we got those stories back, we still had to do a lot of editing to make the stories agree. We had to go back to the authors and say, oh, well, this author actually called that thing something different. So could you change yours? Or this other author described it differently than you. So one of you has to change to match the other. And that's just with 18. And we were there to answer questions. So the fact that 35 authors could come together across 66 books to create something like the Bible is in itself something pretty remarkable. So all that is to say that this love story, this romance, is doing something right. And I'm going to show you how it uses the novel matrix structures to do that. So the Bible is not, if you have a Bible at home, those 66 books aren't arranged in chronological order. Some of them are, but many of them aren't. So you'd have to put them back into order, but it's going to overlay exactly over the 3-act structure that we've been discussing. So let's take a look. So the story begins in the book of Genesis, and God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested. And after he creates the world and he creates man, he says, it was good. And this is our save the cat moment. We see God's intention for man. We see which characters are good, and we see the beginning of the plan God has for man, that man is going to live in perfect harmony and relationship with him. And so that save the cat moment lasts a while. We really don't know how long. The Bible doesn't say if it's a few days or a few years or if it's 5 billion years. We don't know, but like all stories, after that save the cat moment, unfortunately, some bad things begin to happen. So we're introduced to the antagonist, who is named Satan, and man experiences this dramatic downward trajectory of his story. Unfortunately, he is expelled from the Garden of Eden, and rather than living in perfect harmony and relationship with God, he must now toil in the earth to survive. So shortly after that, we have the Great Flood with Noah, where all of mankind is wiped out from the planet Earth, and things just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and there's really no reprieve. Like most stories, though, we do have an old college try. Around 1800 BC, a historic man named Abraham is born, and he follows hard after God, trying to restore his relationship to God, trying to achieve what was lost in the Garden of Eden. And God meets him in that and promises that although Abraham doesn't achieve that complete restoration, God promises him that one of his descendants will, that a descendant of Abraham will one day restore all of mankind to God. But it's just an old college try, so it doesn't work out there, and things get worse and worse and worse until the descendants of Abraham, who are called the Israelites, are thrust into slavery in Egypt, where they are slaves for 400 years. This is the rock bottom moment of the Bible. Things start to get really, really bad in this section of the Bible. Not only are the Israelites in slavery and the conditions there have become unbearable, but the Pharaoh actually decrees that all of the Israelite children under 2 years old are going to be killed in order to control their population. So it can't get any worse than this. They are in these terrible slavery conditions, and they are facing an extinction event if nothing changes. So they're in that position where they are going to be wiped off the face of the earth, or they're going to rise up and do something different. So around 1290 BC, God raises up a real man, who historians recognize. His name is Moses, in order to lead the Israelites out of slavery. So God gives Moses these supernatural powers so that he can get the Pharaoh to release the Israelites from their slavery. And so the Israelites rise up and they leave Egypt. And now this begins us on the montage portion of the second act. And so little by little, over time, we have a lot of ups and downs in this section, but overall, we are on an upward trajectory, and the Israelites are going into what they call the promised land. They're going to this place where they believe that God will be reconciled to them and they will live in perfect peace and harmony the way that God intended, again, sort of like in the Garden of Eden. They are pursuing a way to reconcile the relationship that was lost in shortly after the save the cat moment. So finally, they arrive in the promised land after many ups and downs. And after the course of many events, a king comes into power whose name is King David. David lived in around 1000 BC. And this was the beginning of a dynasty in Israel that was unlike any other kingdom on the planet Earth. So David built these palaces, and then his son Solomon built the temple of God. And the Bible says that God's presence came like fire and filled the temple. And so both David and Solomon had this incredibly personal relationship with God, something that almost rivaled what man had with God in the Garden of Eden originally. And this is the Icarus moment. It really, if there was a way that God could be reconciled to man in an earthly form, this kingdom is it. They have achieved it. But unfortunately, like all Icarus moments, that's not the way it stayed. So due to the Israelites' inability to have a relationship with God, they once again fell into this downward trajectory. And while there are some ups and downs, again, we have some good kings and bad kings and good kings and bad kings that try to recover what David and Solomon had at the pinnacle of this dynasty, but they never really can. And they're constantly under attack from outside enemies until finally the Babylonians take the Israelites into slavery and captivity once again, and they destroy the temple that Solomon had built and leave it in ruins. So things are bad. Things are real bad, and they're only getting worse. So they're trying throughout this period, but there's no reprieve. There are two guys, Ezra and Nehemiah, that do eventually go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But that fiery presence of God that came when Solomon built the temple, it never shows up again. This is just bad news for the Israelites. And the story gets so bad that for about 400 years, the Bible just stops telling the story. There is nothing to report. There's nothing good at all. However, after that 400 years of the biblical dark ages, if you will, the epiphany is about to occur. And the epiphany is the birth of Jesus Christ, who was born to the Virgin Mary. And Jesus comes into the world as God made manifest in human flesh. So God comes to earth as the man Jesus in order to lead us back into the relationship that God intended in the Garden of Eden. And so Jesus is doing things that no one has ever done before. He has power over all kinds of demonic influences and darkness. Sickness leaves at the command of his voice. He even has control over storms. And so Jesus is doing all of these things that prove to the people that are following him that he is indeed God in human form. And so, as more and more people gather around Jesus, he becomes a threat to the political structures there. And as it looks like Jesus is probably going to topple the political powers there and finally do the thing that the Israelites have been waiting for and felt like they were promised in Abraham 2,000 years before that. Just as Jesus is going to do that, and he's coming into Jerusalem, the capital city, and they assume that he's going to finally come to take control of the military and the political system and topple Rome and once again raise Israel up to be that dynasty like they had when David and Solomon were king. Just as that's about to happen, the political leaders conspire together and they kill Jesus. This is the near miss of the story. And Jesus is really dead. He's brutally executed in the most horrific way possible. The Romans were experts in how to torture and kill a person, and he is dead and he is buried. And the disciples at this point in the story are fairly certain that this is the end. They didn't yet understand what Jesus had told them about how the story would end. So the disciples are distraught. Everyone is convinced that this is the end. But we know, because we've studied story structure, that it is not the end, it is the near miss. And so 3 days later, Jesus is raised from the dead. He comes back to life under his own power. And after he's raised to life again, he goes and he teaches his disciples some more. And then he ascends to heaven where he reigns with God. And that's not the climax, though. Here's the really cool thing about this story if we accept the biblical narrative. The climax is when Jesus returns. The climax is when Jesus returns and creates a new heaven and a new earth for everyone that acknowledges him as Lord to rule and reign with him forever, for all eternity. That's the climax that's coming. And right now, we're between the near miss and the climax. But because we've seen this story so many times, we know that the near miss wasn't the end. And we believe that, we can see from the evidence that's hardwired into us and how we understand story that there's something more to come, that the last event of the story hasn't been told. So we have that climax coming when Jesus will reign. And the Bible says that right now, Jesus is reigning in heaven while his enemies are placed under his feet. Until that time when Jesus' rule will be exerted over the entire earth. And then we will enjoy an eternal denouement in the new heaven and the new earth with him. So that's the story of the Bible. Again, you can take it or leave it. You can take it or leave the spiritual and religious significance of the story. But that's the novel matrix structure. I'm not stretching it. That's, if we put the books in chronological order, that's what we have. And there's something powerful about this story. And if we're honest, this story is hardwired into us. I think it's hardwired into us because God wants us to understand the story of humanity. He made us to interface with that story because it's part of our relationship with him. So consider that. The novel matrix is all around us. We see it, movies and books that work typically employ a lot of these structures and systems that we've talked about. We see it in the way that we interact with each other. When your friend tells you a story, part of whether you believe him or not is whether it conforms to the psychology of story. Like, do people have a good reason to change and things like that? And of course, as I've just demonstrated, we also see these structures in the Bible itself. So you have one last assignment this week, and that's to continue brainstorming on your 3 novel ideas. There's no new information to consider, but I do hope that you will continue to go deeper in the novel matrix so that you see the flexibility and the freedom that these tools actually give you. It's not a box. It's not a coffin for your story. It's a skeleton. And it's a basic structure so that you can put the flesh on. You can take this stuff new directions that nobody's ever done before without breaking it, but rather using the tools to your advantage. So continue to brainstorm those ideas because next week you need to pick one. when tomorrow is a break day, and that's important, but on Monday we're going to come back together, and you need to be ready to move forward with one of your ideas at that point. So continue that brainstorming process and begin to settle into one of those ideas. Tomorrow I want you to take a break. And you might be saying, but I'm not tired. Well, I get it. We haven't actually done any real writing this week. So you might not be feeling fatigue from the idea, but writing a novel is a marathon. 90 days is a long time. Part of your success is going to be in your ability to put healthy disciplines into place in the way that you do the work. So you begin tomorrow preventing burnout that would happen 8 weeks from now, because you've already taught your brain that these systems are important and that you're going to work for 6 days and then you're going to rest for one. Then you're going to work for 6 days, rest for one. That's an important rhythm to your work. And if you begin to train your mind and your body to do that now, I promise you, you are going to see more productivity and better results than if you just tried to work 7 days a week for the next 90 days. So enjoy your day off tomorrow. Continue to brainstorm these ideas. Continue to see how the novel matrix systems are all around you, embedded in your life in so many different ways. And until I see you next week, happy writing and be blessed.